How does a movement emerge that can reshape fear into compliance, transform frustration into aggression, and weaponize hope for control? Today, we delve into one of contemporary history's grimmest chapters, the rise of fascism. This ideology didn't begin in elite power structures, but rather in chaotic streets, muddy trenches, striking factories, and within the mind of a single individual who mastered converting grievances into political might. Before we proceed, please consider subscribing to the Past Chronicle. Afterward, leave a comment and suggest other intricate topics or pivotal historical moments you'd like us to investigate. All right, let's now explore what fascism truly is. Europe wasn't always characterized by defined borders, measured rhetoric, or self-assured nations. There was a period when everything appeared fixed, perhaps too fixed. Monarchs, empires, and aristocrats upheld an ancient, nearly static equilibrium, functioning much like an old, rusty machine that continued only through inertia. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks had already formed. A mere spark was all it would take for the antiquated system to collapse. That spark arrived with a declaration that irrevocably altered history. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Revolution not only decapitated royalty, but also dismantled long-held certainties. Suddenly, what had seemed eternal ceased to be. Monarchies trembled, populations stirred, and Europe was engulfed in an uncontrollable tempest. The Napoleonic Wars ravaged the continent. Armies marched ceaselessly, borders were redrawn, and entire kingdoms crumbled. But even more destructive than the battles themselves were the ideas propagated by them. Each French soldier carried something more perilous than a firearm: the infectious spread of a novel worldview. From liberty emerged liberalism. Equality ignited the fervor of socialism. And fraternity, the most emotive and ambiguous of the three, fueled a force that would soon captivate thousands: nationalism. Europe grappled with new inquiries. If all were equal, why did some enjoy privileges while others did not? If all were brothers, who determined membership in that brotherhood? And if the nation now constituted the grand family, what fate awaited those who didn't fit within its confines? A seemingly straightforward revolutionary slogan ultimately became the genesis of ideological conflicts that would define the subsequent centuries. The 19th century didn't resolve these dilemmas. It intensified them. While European powers constructed railway networks, established colonial empires, and built enormous factories, something deeper simmered within the core of every country. Political movements underwent restructuring. National identities were reimagined. Old alliances disintegrated. And though unforeseen at the time, these mounting tensions were cultivating the ground for an ideology that would spring from frustration, wounded pride, and a desperate craving for order: fascism. Ultimately, every extreme movement takes root when society perceives itself to be on the brink of collapse. And Europe, after so many ruptures, was already teetering. The question became unavoidable. Who could offer a solution, even if a perilous one? Italy today appears on maps as a singular nation, a country sharing a language, flag, and sense of pride. Yet for the majority of its history, this was not the case. Before forming a unified boot in the Mediterranean, Italy existed as a fractured mosaic. Kingdoms distrusted each other, cities vied for dominance, territories fell under foreign control, and its populace, despite shared culture and ancient origins, lacked a common destiny. In the mid-19th century, the Risorgimento, a movement promising national rebirth, emerged. Its leaders envisioned transforming that fragmented land into a unified modern country. In 1861, following conflicts, improbable alliances, and popular uprisings, the Kingdom of Italy was officially established, with Victor Emmanuel II ascending the throne. However, its birth was tumultuous, and a nascent nation was already ailing. A unified Italy was not robust. It was fragile, marked by vast disparities between North and South. Regions existed where people didn't even speak the same Italian. Modern industrial cities coexisted with stagnant rural villages, and millions felt alienated from the new state. In theory, Italy existed. In practice, it remained fragmented. The promises of the Risorgimento faded. People had anticipated prosperity, stability, and opportunities. Instead, they encountered bewildering bureaucracy, high taxes, and a political class incapable of truly unifying the nation. Frustration mounted in coffeehouses, factories, and rural areas. People whispered that unification had been an illusion, that Italy was merely a map, not a nation. It was against this backdrop of disillusionment, inequality, and a desperate search for identity that Benito Mussolini was born in 1883. Italy craved answers. Mussolini matured believing he could provide them. In time, millions of Italians would come to share that belief. It was a young country, unstable and rife with unhealed wounds, an ideal environment for an ideology promising order, pride, and greatness to emerge. And that ideology was about to take shape. Benito Mussolini was not born into power, wealth, or the destiny of governing an entire nation. His origins were harsh, almost brutal, as if life itself had molded him through adversity from the outset. Born in 1883 in a small town in the province of Forli, he grew up in the heart of an Italy still grappling with its identity. His family, far from stable, mirrored the tensions that would later divide the nation. His father, a socialist blacksmith, viewed politics as an unavoidable struggle between oppressors and oppressed. He was a man of radical ideas, an admirer of foreign revolutionary figures, so much so that he named his son Benito, honoring Benito Juarez, the Mexican leader who defied an empire and redefined his country's history. His mother, conversely, was a deeply Catholic schoolteacher, disciplined and devout. Two opposing worlds coexisted under one roof, one driven by revolutionary zeal, the other by faith and obedience. From childhood, Benito gravitated more toward conflict than tranquility. Sent to a Catholic school, his explosive nature soon manifested. In a fight, he stabbed another student with a knife and was expelled. That incident, which later became part of his notorious narrative, already revealed the man he would become: impulsive, violent, and unwilling to accept externally imposed boundaries. He later attended a state school where he similarly struggled to conform. Nevertheless, he was brilliant, possessing a restless, insatiable mind, fixated on politics and ideas. From his father, he inherited a passion for ideological debates, fervent speeches, and promises of sweeping change. He quickly became an ardent and resolute socialist. So determined was he that he eventually was exiled in Switzerland for inciting protests, and later in Austria, where he frequently clashed with police. Upon his eventual return to Italy, he discovered a potent weapon in journalism. He didn't merely write. He attacked, agitated, and provoked. He rose to become editor of La Lotta di Classe, The Class Struggle, a combative newspaper whose name clearly articulated its purpose. His knack for mobilizing crowds, manipulating emotions, and delivering inflammatory speeches led him to assume leadership of the National Socialist newspaper Avanti. In 1912, he was young, brilliant, aggressive, a born leader. However, the Mussolini of this era was not yet a fascist. He was a radical socialist, admired even by foreign revolutionaries. Vladimir Lenin, according to some accounts, regarded him as a potential ally in Western Europe. Mussolini seemed destined to lead the Italian left. Yet, all of this was about to unravel. The looming threat of World War I would alter everything. In war, that immense destroyer of ideologies, that monster devouring certainties, would transform the young socialist into the man who would define fascism. The fury was already within him. It only awaited a catalyst. World War I transcended a mere conflict between empires. It was a colossal machine engineered to crush everything it touched: human lives, nations, established beliefs, and ideologies. Before 1914, Europe saw itself as a rational, advanced continent, confident in its power. After 1918, none of that arrogance remained. Only fear, rage, despair, and shattered individuals. For many young Europeans, the war initially presented itself as a romantic calling: to defend the homeland, prove courage, and achieve glory. But upon reaching the trenches, glory decomposed in the mud. Life underground, like human moles digging 70-meter tunnels that filled with rain, blood, and gunpowder, obliterated any notion of combat as heroic. The survivors grasped that the real world was made of explosions and screams, not speeches. The experience was so extreme that it spawned a generation unable to reintegrate into normal life. Those who did return home no longer trusted traditional politics, parliaments, or the old leaders who had sent them to die. Violence ceased to be an exceptional horror and became a method, a language, a political instrument. Benito Mussolini witnessed this transformation. He fought in the Italian and Austrian Alps, was wounded multiple times, and each time he fell, he returned to the front lines. That tenacity fueled his personal myth. The brave man hardened by combat, superior to politicians who spoke from comfortable halls. Mussolini grew convinced that war was a test, distinguishing the weak from the strong, those deserving to lead the nation from those meant to be led. When the war concluded, Italy did not celebrate victory. It experienced it as betrayal. It had lost hundreds of thousands of men, yet failed to acquire the territories it expected. The country was left indebted, divided, and humiliated. Streets were filled with mutilated veterans, factories closed, and farmers were impoverished. Resentment boiled. The sentiment was clear: we gave our lives for the nation, and the nation gave nothing in return. That resentment became a powerful fuel. Veterans began to perceive themselves as a distinct elite, the Trincercrazia, or aristocracy of the trenches. They had confronted chaos, endured suffering, and learned that violence was effective. Why then should they accept the rules of cowardly politicians or movements advocating peace and reforms? The war had prepared thousands to follow a new kind of leader, one unafraid of conflict, one who promised to restore lost pride, one who understood strength as a virtue. And Mussolini was poised to become that leader. Europe lay shattered, Italy too, and amidst those ruins, a new ideology began to crystallize, a movement that viewed violence as regeneration and the nation as a sacred myth. Fascism was not born in a parliament. It was born in the trenches. Italy emerged from World War I as a wounded, frustrated, and profoundly divided country. The trauma of war compounded a ruined economy, closed factories, rampant inflation, and an army of veterans returning home jobless, unsupported, and without hope. It was the perfect breeding ground for social unrest, and that explosion arrived faster than anyone anticipated. Between 1919 and 1920, the country was swept into a maelstrom of turmoil later known as the Biennio Rosso, 2 red years. Inspired by the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Bolsheviks, Italian socialists intensified their struggle. Mass strikes halted transportation and railways. Armed workers occupied entire factories. Cities were symbolically claimed under red flags. In many places, the state simply vanished, and fear began to grip every corner. For the middle class, this was terrifying. Shop owners, small merchants, farmers, and landowners watched as their businesses were looted. Revolutionary unions demanded absolute control, and the liberal government seemed powerless to contain the chaos. The question many Italians whispered in their homes was simple yet agonizing. Who will protect us? The socialists, themselves fractured into moderate, reformist, and radical communist wings, pushed tensions further. From the perspective of thousands of Italians, it appeared a full-scale revolution was imminent. The memory of what had transpired in Russia intensified the panic. Amidst this collective fear, an unexpected counter-response began to emerge. Paramilitary groups composed almost entirely of war veterans. These were men hardened by combat, resentful of the lack of recognition, and who had already learned in the trenches that violence was not only possible but effective. Although not yet organized as a national movement, they began coordinating attacks against unions, strikers, and socialist headquarters. For many Italians, these groups, despite their brutality, appear to be the only force willing to confront the revolutionaries. Some families watched them march through the streets and thought, at least someone is doing something. The state was paralyzed. Parliament couldn't reach agreements. Politicians debated while the country burned. And that paralysis allowed extremists to begin filling the vacuum. It was in this climate, where the left was aflame and the right was trembling, that fascism discovered its opportunity. For in times of panic, any movement promising order, even if imposed by force, could be perceived as a savior. Italian society was on the verge of yielding to anyone who could offer calm, regardless of the cost. When the state loses control, others fill the void. In post-war Italy, these others were not politicians, intellectuals, or diplomats. They were former soldiers, men hardened by World War I, bearing visible scars, and others far deeper. Upon their return home, they found a country that offered them no purpose. Without jobs, recognition, or direction, many sought a new battle to fight. They found it in the streets. Thus were born the squadristi, paramilitary groups formed almost entirely by veterans. Their black uniforms, martial discipline, and readiness for violence made them feared from the outset. Ostensibly, they presented themselves as defenders of a nation against socialist chaos. In practice, they were a private militia operating wherever the state could not, or would not, intervene. For them, violence was not an extreme measure. It was a legitimate tool. They marched through towns and cities, attacking union headquarters, assaulting socialist leaders, destroying printing presses, and breaking up factory occupations. Many Italians, particularly in rural regions, viewed them as protectors. Others saw them as an unchecked malignancy. Yet no one could ignore them. The squadristi's strength lay in their conviction that they were rescuing Italy. They proclaimed themselves the true inheritors of the war, the only ones who had demonstrated courage in the conflict, and the sole individuals capable of saving the nation from chaos. That almost religious sense of nationalist mission made them dangerous, and it was exactly what Benito Mussolini needed. Because although Mussolini publicly supported the squadristi, he was never one of them personally. He did not participate in their violent actions, nor did he lead their offensives or command the beatings. He operated on another level, writing, organizing, and directing. While local leaders known as RAS controlled the militias in different regions, Mussolini positioned himself as the strategic mind behind the movement. It was a delicate balance. He needed the squads, but he could not allow them to wield excessive power. Many RAS grew in popularity and ambition, with some envisioning themselves as future national leaders. Internal tensions were constant. Should they obey Mussolini or act independently? This struggle for control was silent but ever present, like a bomb that could explode within fascism itself. Despite the internal chaos, the squadristi expanded their influence. Between 1919 and 1922, their attacks escalated in both number and brutality. They seized entire towns, humiliated local authorities, nullified elections through intimidation, and destroyed any symbol of the revolutionary left. Their presence fundamentally altered the dynamics of Italian politics. Laws no longer held sway. What mattered was who could enforce them by force. And that was the moment when fascism ceased to be merely a protest movement and became a genuine threat to state power. The squadristi were not only attacking the left, they were attacking the liberal order they intended to replace. Violence was no longer a symptom of Italy's chaos. It had become a political instrument, one that was gradually leading the country down an irreversible path. In the turbulent Italy of the early 20th century, as violence gripped the streets and the state appeared incapable of responding, a new idea began to take shape. It originated not from a politician or a military leader, but from a French thinker, Georges Sorel. His writings would become one of the most profound and dangerous influences in the ideological evolution of Benito Mussolini and the birth of modern fascism. Sorel was no ordinary intellectual. He shifted political positions with disconcerting ease, from the left to the right, from syndicalism to nationalism. But one conviction remained constant, that societies transform not through rational arguments, but through myths. For Sorel, the masses would only mobilize when they believed in an idea so potent that it required no proof, a myth capable of stirring hearts before minds, and of justifying extreme actions, even violence, as a necessary means for societal regeneration. At the close of the 19th century, as industrial Europe simmered with tension, Sorel argued that the proletariat could transform the world through a revolutionary general strike, sustained by the moral energy of workers and, if necessary, by violence. For him, violence was not inherently evil, but a purifying tool. This message, in a continent traumatized by war, would find fertile ground. Mussolini read Sorel, studied him, and absorbed his ideas. His experience in socialism had already taught him to appreciate the power of radical rhetoric, but Sorel offered something deeper, a psychological framework, an explanation for why the masses followed certain leaders over others. The Sorelian myth perfectly aligned with Mussolini's mind, which no longer believed in class struggle as the engine of history. He had discovered a new force, the nation. And so, Mussolini reinterpreted the revolutionary myth. Instead of an international proletarian revolution, his myth would be national unity, a collective dream that transcended social classes and promised the regeneration of Italy. The sacrifice was no longer for the proletariat, but for the homeland. The enemy was no longer the bourgeoisie, but anyone who threatened national unity: socialists, liberals, foreigners, rebellious unionists. Although Italian socialists also employed violence, something historical records clearly demonstrate, Mussolini saw in Cerealian thought the opportunity to appropriate their tactics and redirect them toward a different objective. The fascists aimed to leverage the emotional intensity of the socialist revolution, but replace its content. The collective would no longer be the working class, but the entire nation. This reinterpretation changed everything. It imbued fascism with a kind of mysticism, a historical mission, and a promise of spiritual rebirth. It was no longer merely politics. It was faith. Followers obeyed, not out of self-interest, but out of conviction. Veterans believed in the wounded nation. The bourgeoisie sought security, and young people yearned for action. Everyone found something in the myth. And with a powerful myth, Mussolini no longer needed to persuade. He only needed to ignite. The flame was ready. Sometimes the movements that change history aren't born with an explosion, but with a small group gathered in an almost empty room. That's precisely what occurred on March 23, 1919, when a handful of men, barely 50 strong, met in Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan. No one at that moment imagined that this chaotic group, lacking clear direction, was planting the seed of a political phenomenon that would transform Italy in the entire century. There, amidst impromptu speeches, post-war resentment, and a confused melange of radical ideas, the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento was born, the first organized nucleus of fascism. It was not a political party. It lacked structure and a solid ideology. It was more a collection of frustrations, war wounds, and disordered ambitions, united solely by a shared desire to dismantle the liberal system that, in their view, had betrayed Italy. And that lack of clarity was, simultaneously, both its weakness and its strength. Among those present were impassioned nationalists, revolutionary syndicalists, renegade ex-socialists, violent veterans, and small bourgeoisie frightened by the Biennio Rosso. Some sought to restore national pride. Others desired revenge against the socialists. Still others simply wanted a place where their fury held value. It was a diverse, contradictory, unpredictable movement. The historical record confirms their only commonality was their rejection of the established order. None of those present could precisely define what fascism was, but they all knew exactly what they hated. Despite the founding meeting, the movement still lacked direction. In the 1919 elections, it was a complete failure. Mussolini even lost in his own district. In any other movement, this would have spelled political death. But fascism possessed something no other party had: a paramilitary militia willing to act, while the left was embroiled in endless internal disputes. Rural Italy, especially in the north, became a laboratory of political violence. The RAS, local chiefs of the fascist squads, operated like modern warlords. Sometimes they obeyed Mussolini, sometimes they challenged him. In many towns, these regional leaders wielded more power than the state itself. It was common for them to dictate which businesses could open, which unions had to close, and which local authority deserved a lesson. Fascist violence began to function as propaganda. Wherever the socialists lost control, the fascists filled the vacuum. Wherever the state was unable to protect, the fascists presented themselves as guardians. Their brutality generated horror, but also obedience. And in an Italy terrified by the threat of a communist revolution, horror could become an effective political tool. That is why, although the movement was still disorganized, it was growing in numbers, in influence, and above all in conviction. The feeling across the country was unsettling. Something was advancing. Something new, something dark. A storm that still had no clear shape, but could already be felt in the air. Fascism was not yet a party. It was not yet a government. It was not yet Mussolini marching on Rome. But it was already an unstoppable phenomenon. By 1919, fascism had already shown its true colors in the streets: violence, intimidation, black shirts marching as if they owned the country. But now it had to face another battlefield: formal politics. And there, Mussolini's movement was about to receive a humiliating blow. Historical records make it clear. The elections of 1919 were a complete disaster for the fascists. They achieved virtually nothing. Mussolini even lost in his own district. Urban Italians, especially organized workers and the left, strongly rejected the nascent movement. Liberals ignored it. Socialists despised it. For many observers, fascism seemed doomed to die before it even turned 2 years old. However, political analysts overlooked a critical point. Mussolini was operating by a fundamentally different rulebook. While established parties relied on public addresses, parliamentary coalitions, and electoral races, Mussolini had already grasped a truth that would reshape Italy's destiny. In nations with fragile institutions, genuine power stems not from ballot boxes, but from organized force. And he already commanded his own private army. The RAS, regional figures functioning as local military commanders, steadily expanded their influence throughout the rural areas, particularly across Emilia-Romagna, Tuscany, and Lombardy. The squadristi dismantled labor unions, intimidated city council members, interfered with municipal elections, and coerced officials into resignation. With fear dictating outcomes, elections lost their significance. Meanwhile, the socialist movement, despite its considerable strength, suffered from deep internal divisions. Reformists clashed with revolutionaries, and a cohesive leadership was conspicuously absent. Anarchists refused to cooperate, and the recently formed Communist Party further weakened the left by fragmenting both votes and energy. Italy possessed a formidable left wing, yet one unable to forge a unified strategy. This strategic void presented Mussolini with an invaluable opportunity. As socialists debated theoretical points, fascists were actively accumulating tangible power. While liberals delivered speeches on legalities, the squadristi brought entire towns to heel through violence. And as Parliament deliberated reforms that never materialized, thousands of desperate Italians began to perceive in the black shirts something the state couldn't offer: decisive action. Fascism, even without popular votes, was steadily gaining control of the nation from the ground up. Historical records also reveal another vital aspect. Many wealthy industrialists and landowners began secretly funding the squads. From their perspective, these groups weren't dangerous extremists, but a necessary deterrent against the socialists. Private capital financed their uniforms, weaponry, transport, and propaganda. With this backing, Mussolini transcended his role as a mere agitator and evolved into a formidable political figure. It wasn't long before a crucial realization dawned on him. If electoral processes couldn't deliver Italy, then a march would have to. Thus, an idea started to form in his mind. Not an election, nor a parliamentary accord. Instead, a symbolic, potent, and perilous act to advance on Rome and assert control over the entire country. Politics, he concluded, was no longer about discourse. It was about conflict. Italian politics in the early 1920s resembled an aged, fractured edifice, still standing but sustained more by momentum than by genuine stability. Parliament was gridlocked by incessant disagreements. The left was consumed by internal schisms. The middle class lived in apprehension. And in the provinces, armed factions were accomplishing what the authorities could no longer manage. It was an ideal landscape for an ambitious individual like Mussolini. At this juncture, historical accounts unequivocally show that the fascist movement was not a party in the conventional sense. It was a fluid entity, a swarm. It consisted of autonomous militias, regional RAS who operated without seeking approval, intellectuals devising justifications for violence, nationalist youth craving action, and disillusioned veterans who had lost faith in all institutions. Mussolini recognized that if he aimed to seize Italy, he first had to transform this chaotic multitude into a more organized force. And he made the effort. He organized conferences, drew up policy platforms, and attempted to instill discipline among local leaders. However, the RAS, proud, aggressive, and convinced of their territorial control, were unwilling to blindly obey a man they viewed as merely another politician. In their eyes, Mussolini relied on them, not the reverse. The friction was ceaseless. Simultaneously, the socialists continued to lose influence. Although they still maintained robust working-class support, particularly in major urban centers, their internal fragmentation left them exposed. And whenever they attempted to reassert control in a rural area, the squadristi retaliated with beatings, arsons, and public humiliations. Over time, many citizens began to resign themselves to the fascist presence, finding it easier to acquiesce than to resist. So, what the state proved unable to manage, Mussolini expertly leveraged to his advantage. At this point, a fundamental truth became increasingly evident to him. He would never attain power through the mechanisms of the liberal system. That very system had embarrassed him in the 1919 elections. It permitted the existence of parties that despised him. That system was nearing its end, but it hadn't yet collapsed entirely. To capture Italy, he required an action that would project strength, unity, and resolve, something sufficiently intimidating to compel the king and political leaders to entrust him with the government. A symbolic, dramatic, powerful act. A march. The fascists had previously employed violence as a localized tactic, but Mussolini understood the time had come to elevate that violence to a national scale. To achieve this, he needed to persuade the RAS to coordinate their actions for the first time under a single banner. He had to organize a movement inherently opposed to order. He needed to reconcile conflicting egos, broker alliances, and temper ambitions. And while engaged in all these endeavors, he simultaneously portrayed himself in the press as the sole individual capable of rescuing Italy from chaos. Gradually, the nation began to sense it. Something monumental was in the making. Fascist rhetoric promised redemption, rebirth, and a robust new state. Secret gatherings multiplied. Regional leaders collaborated as never before. The squads received precise directives. The plan, conceptually straightforward but perilous in execution, was to mobilize thousands of black shirts and direct them toward Rome. Not to conquer the city by force, but to demonstrate their capability. Not to dismantle the government, but to compel its capitulation. Mussolini did not desire civil war. He sought a demonstration of power, so overwhelming that the mere threat of it would prevent civil conflict. And so, as the nation paid little attention, the future dictator prepared his most audacious maneuver, a move destined to transform Italy forever. Italy awoke in October 1922 with an indescribable feeling. It wasn't precisely fear. It wasn't precisely hope. It was something closer to a collective foreboding, as if the entire country held its breath anticipating an earthquake. And that earthquake bore name, the March on Rome. For weeks, the RAS had been assembling their forces. Seasoned veterans, nationalist youths yearning for glory, disgruntled peasants, and merchants weary of instability. In all, nearly 40,000 black shirts stood ready to advance. They were militias, not professional soldiers. Yet, they saw themselves differently, believing they were on the verge of liberating Italy from its political decay. What remains both surprising and profoundly unsettling is that the operation was conceived with greater boldness than practical logistics. They lacked sufficient food, weaponry, or vehicles to sustain an extended engagement. However, their objective wasn't military conquest. It was psychological. They aimed to impress, to intimidate, and to project strength without having to employ it on a grand scale. Historical accounts reveal a crucial detail. Benito Mussolini himself did not join the march. He did not lead the column. He did not wear combat boots. He observed the entire unfolding event from Milan, awaiting the precise moment to intervene, much like a chess master maneuvering pieces without stepping onto the board. The plan commenced on October 27th. Black shirts advanced toward the capital from multiple points across the country. Trains transported entire formations, and rural roads teemed with armed contingents. Some towns greeted their arrival with applause, while others shuttered their doors and windows. In Rome, the liberal government fell into disarray. The Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, proposed declaring a state of siege. The army was prepared to act and could have easily repelled the fascists. However, one significant obstacle stood in their way: King Victor Emmanuel III. Historical records are unambiguous. When Facta presented the decree for the king's signature, he declined. He was unwilling to authorize repression. He did not wish to confront the fascists. He feared a civil war. And perhaps even more significantly, he feared being on the wrong side of history. His hesitation proved to be the decisive turning point. With a single act, the monarch allowed the liberal government to collapse and cleared the path for Mussolini. On October 29th, the king summoned Mussolini. At that moment, the fascist leader was far from the marching columns, staying in a hotel, dressed in a suit, composed, and showing no signs of battle. He boarded a train to Rome, arriving not as a rebel, but as a statesman. The very next day, the king appointed him president of the Council of Ministers, the nation's highest office. The irony is stark. The March on Rome is commonly recalled as a violent seizure of power. Yet in reality, power was simply handed over. The black shirts entered the capital days later, already triumphant and unopposed, parading through the cobblestone streets like a victorious army. Even though they had not engaged in a single actual battle, Italy was irrevocably altered. Fascism was no longer merely a militia or a fringe movement. It was the new government. And this transformation occurred simply because at the critical juncture, the state chose not to defend itself. The march had concluded. The dictatorship had just begun. When the black shirts paraded into Rome amidst cheering crowds, waving flags, and rhythmic footsteps, many Italians believed they were witnessing the dawn of a new era. And they were. But what was truly emerging was not merely a government, nor a revitalized political party, nor a simple administrative overhaul. What was taking shape was an entire ideology, something far deeper, more visceral, and more perilous: fascism. For decades, historians have striven to define it precisely. However, fascism resists easy encapsulation in a single phrase. It is an unusual hybrid, a blend that incorporates elements from both the left and the right: nationalism, syndicalism, militarism, and even cultural romanticism. It is a movement inherently contradictory, yet remarkably consistent in its ultimate objectives. At its core, fascism can be understood as an emotional and aggressive response to a society in turmoil. For fascists, the nation transcends a mere political collective. It is a living entity, a singular body, a sacred family that must remain pure, potent, and cohesive. Consequently, anything that threatens this unity, be it liberalism, communism, parliamentarism, criticism, or pluralism, must be eradicated. Not debated, not discussed, destroyed. Historical records underscore that fascism originates from feelings of resentment, national humiliation, and the apprehension of decline. This is why its fundamental promise remains constant: to restore a lost golden age. The country and the historical period are irrelevant. Fascism invariably asserts that the nation was once mighty, that external forces weakened it, and that only strong leadership can rejuvenate it. And to achieve that regeneration, every means becomes justifiable: censorship, violence, the veneration of a leader, the elimination of adversaries, absolute state control, and the persecution of both real and imagined enemies. Fascism supplants reason with myth, politics with unquestioning faith, and debate with obedience. Its adherents do not see themselves as activists, but as soldiers committed to a historical mission. This is precisely why it becomes so challenging to combat once it assumes power. Because it doesn't reside in legal frameworks, it thrives on emotions. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this: fascism does not require ideal circumstances to surface. It merely needs a frustrated, polarized society, weary of the existing system, and ready to heed someone who declares with unwavering conviction, "I can fix everything provided you follow me." What began with a mere 50 men in Milan ultimately evolved into a regime that would alter the course of Italian history, and subsequently, global history. A regime that demonstrated that democracies, when they fail to defend their own principles, can succumb to those who promise order at any cost. So what exactly is fascism? It serves as a historical caution, a recurring specter that emerges whenever a nation loses faith in itself. And perhaps that is why, despite Mussolini's downfall decades ago, the question persists: how far can a society go when its fear of chaos outweighs its fear of tyranny? Fascism did not emerge from a vacuum. It was born from unhealed wounds, from collective anxiety, from a nation that fell adrift. It flourished in the silence of incapacitated institutions, in the resentment of forgotten veterans, and in the disillusionment of citizens who had lost trust in politics. It fed on disorder and offered the promise of stability. Italy, exhausted and fearful, embraced that promise. But the price was its freedom. And herein lies the most crucial lesson: authoritarian regimes do not always arrive with military might or civil strife. Sometimes they arrive with captivating speeches, with assurances of national revival, with leaders who claim to possess all the answers. They emerge when society is fatigued, fractured, and disenchanted. They arrive incrementally, and then all at once. Fascism was, above all, a historical admonition. When fear eclipses reason, when the nation transforms into an idealized myth, when the adversary becomes an all-consuming obsession, democracy ceases to be an inherent right and devolves into a precarious privilege. And even though Mussolini eventually fell, his shadow lingers. A shadow that reappears whenever a country feels betrayed, humiliated, or internally divided. The question isn't whether fascism can reemerge, because ideas rarely vanish. Rather, it's whether we will recognize it when it attempts to be reborn in new guises. History doesn't replicate itself precisely, but it often echoes. Italy in the 1920s serves as a stark reminder of what transpires when a desperate populace entrusts its future to someone who pledges salvation, demanding nothing in return but absolute obedience. For in the end, this is how freedom perishes, not with a violent eruption, but with thunderous applause. Thank you for watching until the end. If you found this video engaging and are keen on this type of content, please consider subscribing to the channel to ensure you don't miss upcoming videos and to explore more compelling narratives. I'll see you in the next one.